Hello and welcome to another edition of Pointcast with me, Lishin, coming to you from Beijing. My guest today is Ambassador Chas Freeman. I would even use the word legendary to describe him. Give me just a second to tell you a little bit about his career. He's a retired career diplomat from the United States. He served in many different important positions, such as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. He also worked as Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires in the American embassies in Bangkok and in Beijing as early as in the 1980s, in fact, and that's the reason why I'm particularly looking forward to this discussion. He was the principal American interpreter during late US President Nixon's path-breaking visit to China in 1972. He now chairs Projects International. So a lot to unpack, and of course we're going to focus on and start with the negotiations between the US and Iran. That was broken down, but there's discussion, there's news that it might pick up in just a couple of days' time. So a lot of details, but we also want to look through, if I may use the word, smog that's surrounding the development. We also will talk about the future of NATO and, of course, the very important bilateral relationship between China and the United States. Before we start the discussion, as usual, I'll ask you to consider subscribing to our channel, give me a thumbs up, or leave a comment, question, even criticism. I go through all of them, although I probably won't reply to each and every one of them, but I do read them, and all of this helps us improve. So without much ado, let's get started. Ambassador Freeman, thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the podcast.
Well, I appreciate the invitation and I'm glad to meet you.
Glad to meet you. So let's get started with the latest coming out of the talks between the United States and Iran. I'm seeing there seems to be some hopes of another round of negotiations between these two sides in just a couple of days' time after the first round broke down. What is your take of what happened in Islamabad a couple of days ago and the fact that they might pick up the talks again?
Well, there was essentially a make-believe ceasefire, a performative ceasefire. It didn't exist. The two sides really couldn't agree what they had agreed about. There was no meeting of the minds at all. I think Pakistan deserves a great deal of credit for bringing the two together and actually persuading them to meet directly rather than indirectly, as they'd done in the past. But each side approached the discussions differently. The American side was bound by Donald Trump's effort to portray the war as something we had won. That is, the United States had won. The Iranian side, very, very sure of its position, knew that it had not lost. And so we had on the American side a delegation that was very heavy on political representation, people with close relationships with Donald Trump and also with Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, who drove the entire agenda on the American side. On the Iranian side, we had professional negotiators, diplomats with great experience, and technical staff, a very comprehensive negotiating team. And they couldn't reach any essential agreement. As I understand it, reading between the lines, Iran essentially offered that to allow the United States to dismantle its nuclear facilities and programs cooperatively if the United States would cooperate with Iran to do the same in Israel. And of course, this immediately excited the Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Netanyahu, who was essentially giving instructions to the Vice President of the United States during these negotiations. So this was foreordained to fail, and it did. Whether it can resume or not is an open question, and we'll just see.
What gives you the impression that this was a make-believe ceasefire, first of all? And secondly, what do you look at the fact that despite all the mistrust, despite all the, the fakeness or the surrealness of the appearances, it was the highest level U.S. Official, J.D. Vance, vice president, that were engaging in direct negotiations with the Iranians, with the presence of the Pakistanis, of course. What led that to happen?
Well, yes, you're quite correct. That is important. It was the first time, really, since the Islamic Revolution in Iran that we had had a meeting at this level, and one should not belittle the importance of that. But I would say that the basic problem here is, I hate to say this as an American and as a former diplomat, a misunderstanding on the part of the United States. We sort of imagine that the outcome of wars is determined by who has the best technology and the most bombs. But we should have learned from our experiences with Vietnam, with Afghanistan, and other experiences that war is a battle of wills. The balance of fervor between the parties determines a great deal. For Iran, this is an existential war. Iran has been subjected to decades of attacks by Israel, more recently joined by the United States, and it is determined to contrive a situation where this no longer happens. So it has to either restore or establish deterrence against Israel and the United States, or destroy Israel. When Israel's objective, which is very clear, is to collapse the Iranian state and remove Iran as an obstacle to expansion and domination of West Asia. So this is existential for both parties. The United States is not involved existentially. We can afford to win or lose this war. Donald Trump, however, must win it politically. So we come into these discussions with a great handicap, imagining that because we have done huge damage to Iran, that Iran has lost the war. But Iran has demonstrated, as North Vietnam did during the Indochina Wars, that it is prepared to accept enormous suffering in pursuit of its strategic objective. The war is not over. I think the way to think of this is that the war has been going on for decades at low intensity. It has been at high intensity recently, and it's in a lull, but it's not over. And I'm reminded of the comment of Georges Clemenceau, the leader of France after World War I, who said that the negotiations, peace negotiations, are the war after the war. But the war has not ended. It's still going on. Whether it continues to go on only at the negotiating table or reverts to kinetic action, bombing, and missile firings is now an open question. So I say this is a make-believe peace because there was no meeting of the minds about what the terms of the ceasefire. Donald Trump essentially seems to recognize that the war is a failure. He wants an exit from it. And he grasped the Iranian 10 points as a basis for discussion. But he continues to insist that the United States won the war. This doesn't have much credibility. And he's in a great difficulty. If he resumes the bombing, then he discredits his own claim of victory. What happened to the victory if you have to resume the fighting? If he accepts Iran's terms, he also is embarrassed because it shows there was no victory. He admits defeat. So what he has done instead is a really wild and ill-considered action, which is a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. So in effect, he's joined Iran in blockading the strait. And this holds the entire world hostage. And it is very strange indeed. You don't normally put out fires by dumping gasoline on them, but that is basically what he's done. So this is a very dangerous and imponderable situation. We don't know how it's going to turn out.
Yeah, so you already touched upon a lot of the things. Indeed, it's a huge puzzle, but um, is it worthwhile then to follow the minute details that are coming out here and there, bits and, there are so many pieces to this puzzle, and then every piece seems to have been in great fuzz. You don't really know what you're looking at. For instance, the nuclear issue, for instance, the Strait of Hormuz, the blockade, and so on and so forth. How should we understand the situation? I was going to ask you more details, but it seems that more details will only confuse us. So exactly what are we looking at? Are we looking at the war continue to go on despite some level of willingness for both sides to sit down and talk, or is there going to be some kind of at least temporary agreement so that the firepower will stop for the time being, at least? What are we looking at?
Well, I think I'll make two comments. First, we're in an era in which, at least in the West, nothing is true and everything is plausible. And we cannot tell what is true and what is false. And therefore, discussing the details tends to end up being very misleading. Second, I think, as in the case of Ukraine, the prospect of a negotiated resolution of the problem is remote. And in the case of Ukraine, it's clear that the Russian Federation has concluded that the war will be ended on the ground, not at the negotiating table. That is, when an appropriate balance is achieved and Russia has achieved its objectives, it will find a way to end the war, but not before. And I think the same is now true of Iran. For Iran, this is a very important moment. Iran has achieved a number of objectives, one of which is reversed by the blockade. It did succeed in getting relief from the sanctions against its oil exports. Iran has actually been exporting more oil than ever during this war, and it has done so by operating a sort of toll booth on the Strait of Hormuz, where countries that are dependent on oil imports from it or gas imports can reach an agreement with it, and if by paying a fee, about $2 million in either cryptocurrency or Iranian rials or Chinese yuan, can achieve transit of the strait for their ships. These are two major achievements. Iran has also battered Israel very badly. We don't know how badly because military censorship has extended to satellite coverage of Israel, and we can't see the battle damage, but we do know that it is extensive. It has posed a dilemma for the Gulf Arab states. It has said to them, basically, you will not be able to export through the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, unless you get rid of the American bases on your territory, which threaten us. And all of this leads eventually to some kind of discussion, some kind of negotiation, but we're not there yet. And so I think, as is the case in Ukraine, things are going to go on for a while. And that's absolutely catastrophic for the global economy. The Trump decision to blockade the Strait of Hormuz basically, in my view, will unite the entire world against the United States, because it's going to tip the global economy into recession. It hurts everybody. China manages better than others, I think, but still everyone is hurt, including China. And there is no strategy at present for war termination. So we have a make-believe ceasefire followed by what is essentially a phony and unsustainable blockade. It can't be sustained. It will not work. And so I think pressure is going to mount for a diplomatic solution from every quarter. And we'll see what happens. As Donald Trump likes to say, we'll see what happens.
What about the Iranian side? In one of your previous online interviews, you said for the Iranians it was a hell no to the idea of negotiations, and yet this time they again agreed to sit down and with a large delegation and to give it another try. What do you think is going on in their mind that they're willing to engage once again?
Oh, I think Iran is very definitely willing to engage. The war after the war, as I put it, is the negotiations. The war has not ended. Iran wants to achieve its strategic objectives, which are very simple. Deterrence of a future Israeli and American attack, another one. The removal of the American military presence from the Persian Gulf, the control of the Strait of Hormuz in cooperation with Oman, which has the other littoral on the strait. Of course, the latter issue is very disturbing because if it is basically a violation of international law, and it sets a precedent for control of other straits. For example, the Strait of Malacca, which is of concern to everyone in Pacific Asia. So there's a lot at stake here, and I think in the end, there cannot be a solution in the Persian Gulf without the participation of the greatest stakeholders in access to its resources. That includes Europe, if there is a Europe, if Europe is capable of acting in a coherent fashion. It includes China, it includes Japan, it includes the Republic of Korea, South Korea. It includes other countries in Southeast Asia. It includes India, which has been probably the major victim of the war in terms of economic fallout. Very complicated, not easy to solve, resolvable if there is regime change in Washington, perhaps, resolvable if there is regime change in Israel. There has been no regime change in Iran other than the consolidation of a very hardline nationalist position.
So, just now you mentioned a couple of things. It really seems that the goals of the two sides are totally incompatible at this moment. For instance, you
Correct.
were talking about the discussion of the removal of Israeli nuclear capability. From any outsider's perspective, that just given the kind of hardline and hawkish position of the Israeli government at this moment, for decades, that seems like a totally no-go, just not possible. This is one thing. And then for the United States to talk about, removing its military presence in the region, will the United States ever agree to that kind of demand from the Iranians? If
I think
not, yeah, if
I,
not, then there's no possibility that either sides can come to a middle ground and find a compromise, which is a deal.
well, I think you're quite right. If the United States goes on as we have done after the end of the Cold War, the prospects of our agreeing to remove our presence from the Persian Gulf are very near zero. On the other hand, the countries there have agency. It's in their interest to have a workable relationship with Iran and access to the Strait of Hormuz. And in practical terms, there's no military way to open that strait. So that means it has to be opened by diplomacy. And that means they will have to compromise with Iran sooner or later. Some of them, like the United Arab Emirates, are very angry at Iran and very disinclined to compromise with it. Others, like Saudi Arabia, for example, phone calls are taking place between the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia and his counterpart in Iran. So, and Qatar is rumored to have made a serious effort to reach an agreement with Iran. So they will be different, each of them. As far as Israel is concerned, basically, Israel claims the United States echoes the Israeli position that the principal source of instability in West Asia is Iran. But nobody in the region accepts that. Everybody knows the principal source of instability is Israeli expansionism. So Israel has a choice. If it wants to live at peace with its neighbors, it's going to have to compromise. So far, in 78 years, it has never once put forward a peace proposal of its own. It has been dragged into peace through American mediation. But American mediation no longer has any credibility, thanks to the way that we've handled the negotiations with Iran. On two occasions, Donald Trump's personal envoys, Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, have deliberately served as decoys to deceive Iran while preparations were made for a surprise attack on him. There's no trust at all in these men. And I don't think J.D. Vance had, I think the Iranian delegation in Islamabad had pretty full authority. I mean, it was not easy for Iran to agree to go there, frankly. But the internal divisions were resolved, and Mr. Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Parliament, and the Foreign Minister Hakchi were able to go, and they had full authority. They had a comprehensive delegation, as I said. I don't think J.D. Vance had that authority. He was constantly on the telephone with Donald Trump and with Benjamin Netanyahu. And so I think he said that we were flexible, the United States was flexible. I don't see much evidence of that, frankly. And so I think we're going to have to go through some more suffering on all sides before people reconsider the positions they've taken.
On the other hand, President Trump is said to be under tremendous pressure to exit the war as quickly as possible. There's his political future at stake. You also mentioned here, and he was looking at a visit to China mid-May. It seemed that he had some kind of time frame, how soon he wants to wrap it up. Clearly, seems to be aware of the growing general feeling that's against the war, especially in the United States, even among his voters. So how much hand does he have? How much space does he have to play this? I don't want to negotiate as the Iranians, while he's really kind of pressed by time. Do you share this point?
I think he's quite desperate to get out of this war. He recognizes now belatedly that it was a grave mistake. And indeed, his support in the United States is now at its lowest level. His own MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement, has split, with some of his strongest previous supporters now criticizing him. And he is mainly concerned about his own domestic prestige, not about international reactions. I would say there are two things about Donald Trump that you have to bear in mind. His previous experience as a real estate mogul in New York had two elements. First, his manner of negotiation with others was coercive. He had as his deputy, his assistant, Roy Cohn, the previous counsel to McCarthy in the McCarthy era in the 1950s, one of the most vicious, combative people that the human species has ever produced. And he basically would threaten his counterparts with ruin, either financial or legal. So that's the first thing. That's his method of negotiation, is coercive. It is bullying. Second, however, when he fails, as he has done repeatedly, he declares bankruptcy and walks away from the problem with no obligation at all to anybody. And what he's trying to do in the case of this war is just that: declare victory and leave. The problem for him is that his declarations, his claims of victory are not very credible, either domestically or internationally. And so he keeps saying, we won, we won, we won. But the war goes on.
So one more question about, the ins and outs of the details we're seeing. Maybe it's not so much about the details. I want to get rid of the smog. It's not fog because it's man-made, let's call it smog. Behind seeing through the smog, what kind of point are we standing in history here?
Well, this is a moment of great importance in history. 500 years, 5 centuries of European or Euro-Atlantic, Euro-American domination of world affairs are over. The alliance system the United States built during the Cold War is decaying rapidly. The Pax Americana, meaning the domination of world affairs by a single actor, the United States, which happened after the Cold War and the end of the bipolar order, is gone. And the United States is losing influence and friends and alliances in every quarter of the globe. I think there's no doubt that in West Asia, which we've been talking about, American influence is at a very low ebb. So this is a moment in history in which the world order is changing, the regional orders are changing. Other countries than the United States, great powers like China, Russia, India, are resurgent, and middle-ranking powers like Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Iran or Ukraine or Poland, just to name a few, or Brazil, are newly assertive. And we've just seen in the case of Iran's war with the West, with the United States, the West totally disunited, the United States all on its own with Israel, and Iran able to stand us off. So Iran basically has been able to keep the US Navy at bay, some 1,000 kilometers from its shores, because if the Navy comes into a range of Iranian drones and missiles, it risks being sunk. So militarily, we're in a new era. Drone warfare is now the norm. There is total transparency. You can see everything from space or from a drone. So what I think is happening in the world order is, I don't like the term multipolar, because a pole is the end of a two-dimensional line. So you have 2 poles on a line. But we're in a period in which there are multiple connections. I think the word is nodes, jiedian in Chinese, and this is a 3-dimensional object which connects many things. And you can have a very strong economic relationship, for example, as the United States and China do, and yet have a terrible military relationship or a very questionable political relationship. And this can change. If we do the right things, we could adjust that. And this is also part of a network. China is not just connected to the United States, and the United States not just connected to China. We have many other connections. So we're in a very, very complex, multidimensional environment now, and it should not be described as multipolar, in my view, because it's far more dynamic.
I see your point. You actually, while you were Assistant Secretary of Defense, you actually earned the highest public service honor from formerly the Department of Defense for your roles in designing a NATO center post-Cold War European security system. And now there is a great chasm, if I can use a growing one, between America and its European allies. Do you miss the era where you had, the post-Cold War European security system? What do you think is happening today?
Well, we had a question. There was a question after the Cold War. There were many advocates in Washington of expanding NATO to the east, notwithstanding assurances that had been given to the Russians about that. And so I asked the question, if NATO is the answer, what was the question? And I concluded there were actually many reasons to preserve NATO, that the United States needed a role in European security. It would balance the powers within Western Europe so that Germany did not dominate. It would bring in Russia and balance Russia. We had a Russian NATO council to do that. And I put together something called the Partnership for Peace. And that was one of two things, depending on how we chose to use it. It was either the essence of a cooperative security system, which could operate as the Concert of Europe did in the 19th century to preserve peace in Europe as a whole, or it could become a path to NATO enlargement. The path to NATO enlargement was the one that the Clinton administration and its successors chose. That was a mistake, in my view. And the result is not a Europe whole and free, as we hoped, but a Europe divided once again between confrontational parties, the Russian Federation on one side and NATO on the other. I don't think that serves European interests or American interests. It certainly doesn't serve Russian interests. And the result is the war in Ukraine. And I'm very disappointed with our European partners because I see no proposals for peace or long-term security architecture in Europe from them. What I see are calls for continued war in Ukraine and a gross exaggeration of the threat that Russia poses to the rest of Europe. And so I think we're going to have to address the three issues that Moscow has raised. First, within Ukraine, do minorities like the 29% of Ukrainians who are native Russian speakers have the right to use their language, as indeed is guaranteed by the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, or not? Or second, is Ukraine going to return to the neutrality in which it was born and become both a buffer and a bridge between Russia and the rest of Europe? And third, can we have a discussion of a security architecture, perhaps linked to Eurasian security architecture more broadly, that reassures Russians against European attack? After all, they've been attacked twice, by France under Napoleon, by Germany under Hitler. They've not attacked Western Europe. They've won wars in which they've ended up in Europe. And second, of course, Europeans must be reassured against the possibility of Russian threats. So we need to do all these things. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be any willingness to engage.
Do you think the war in Iran and President Trump is giving European leaders, including NATO leaders, more things to think about? Maybe it is finally time to change, because you said the Europeans are kind of tired of appeasing Trump. They are getting tired of pleasing this tyrant. Do you think finally there will be a tipping point for some kind of action? They have been talking about, autonomy for a long time.
I think there has been a tipping point. I mean, after all, the United States has launched this war, which has enormous implications for European prosperity and security, as well as for that of other countries, without consulting anyone. And it has demanded that Europe basically follow the United States into the war. Europeans have refused to do that, quite understandably. But beyond that, we've seen the unraveling of the American presence in Europe begin. Spain has refused the use of bases by the United States to support the war in West Asia. It's now banned our use of its airspace. France, which has no American bases, has done the same. The major air base at Sigonella in Sicily has been denied to the United States. And we're seeing others basically hedging. Donald Trump may portray increased defense expenditures in Germany or elsewhere, Japan, for example, as buttressing some sort of American leadership. That's not what they are. They are hedging. They are developing their own independent capacity to act. And whether they act responsibly or not is not going to be controlled anymore by the United States. So, yes, I think the NATO alliance which served us very well during the Cold War, did provide a balance and defend Western Europe against a very ambitious Soviet Union. But it's dying, and Donald Trump is responsible for that.
Do you think, though, it is a Trump thing or is it an America thing? Meaning, when President Trump, when the Trump era is over, will things go back to where we were?
No, they won't. He has fundamentally transformed things. He has been governing without regard to the Constitution, the responsibilities of the United States Congress, and without regard to his duties to faithfully execute the laws of the United States. And he's done enormous damage both domestically and internationally, and this is not going to be easily repaired. It's a very rare thing. I can't think of another example, really, where a country that had so many advantages conferred on it by geography, by history, by a successful economy, and so on, had basically dismantled its own power. But that is what we are doing. And so our role, the American role in the future, is now very much up for grabs. And we will still be a very major country, of course. We may indeed continue to have the most powerful military on the planet. That's possible for a while. But inevitably, we are being reduced to one country among others in this multinodal system that I described.
Which leads me to my last question or last point. Actually, is a very important one as I come from China, and let's talk about America's relationship with China or Trump's relationship with China. He, despite all of the destructive actions he has taken in terms of consequence, also in U.S.-China relations, he has, to some extent, kept U.S.-China relationship stable on a political level, at least. The tariff war was not great at all, but he has not been criticizing China as some of his predecessors in terms of human rights, in terms of ideology. He has actually been talking about his great relationship with Chinese leader, with the Chinese people. He's looking forward to visit to China. How do you look at that? How do you look at the fact that, he has actually kept the U.S.-China relationship on a relatively stable path?
Well, I think it's important, as you mentioned, that the ideological element, which agitates other politicians, does not apparently have much to do with his thinking. The achievement of rapprochement between China and the United States, which I was involved with during the Nixon trip, and the Shanghai Communique, had as its central premise setting aside ideological socioeconomic differences and recognizing that we had common challenges which we could meet, if not together, at least in parallel, with parallel policies that pursued a different course but ended up at the same result. So this is essential. Unfortunately, however, the state of U.S.-China relations is essentially, I would say, one of minimal stability. It is, and we have lost the aspiration to achieve much of a positive nature. We're in a holding pattern. Somebody will come along, I hope also indifferent to ideology or able to transcend it, not talking about differences in values and social systems and so forth, and accepting the realities as they are. And we'll come up with a positive agenda for the relationship. But I don't expect that much to come out of the possible May visit of President Trump to Beijing, because I think the ambition on both sides is basically to keep a minimal stability, not to make trouble for each other, rather than to actually move forward in a fundamental way on any issue. And there are many issues on which we could move forward. together or in parallel. But we're not at this point apparently much interested in doing that.
Well, after all of the trouble, the very depressing development, the the instability and the minimum stability, let's try to recall some highlights, some positive spirit when you were sitting next to President Nixon meeting, the Chinese leader Mao Zedong or Zhou Enlai back in 1972. Is there a moment that you can still recall that you haven't recounted so much, perhaps, that you want to highlight for us at this moment, and just to give ourselves a sense of hope, things will get better if the great majority of people keep doing the right things?
Well, actually, I never met Mao Zedong because President Nixon was paranoid. He didn't take anybody from the Department of State or the Foreign Service to the meeting. And indeed, there was no Chinese speaker on the American side in that meeting. So we have no idea whether Zheng Hanshi or Tang Wansheng or somebody made up whatever Chairman Mao was saying. Anyway,
I
I
guess
regret.
they don't. I don't think they do, but
No,
I have no way to prove that.
I'm being facetious. Of course, they're very serious, honest people. I like both of them. But the but anyway, no, I would say my own experience with U.S.-China relations, which goes back. I started learning Chinese on January 2nd, 1969,
Wow.
and that was not long before the Nixon trip. I took to the language easily. I liked it. I'm very comfortable with Chinese people.
And you still have very good accent, by the way,
Well,
Ambassador
thank
Freeman.
you. I don't ever
You
have the
do.
opportunity to speak, but I have, my experience suggests that there's every reason to be optimistic about the relationship. I mean, I went to China 1972. Well, I had been in Taiwan, of course, before that, also part of China. Sometime after the third plenum in December 78, women started wearing colorful clothing. I see you're dressed very attractively. So anyway, I think I've seen China come alive, come from poverty to wealth, relatively speaking, go from primitive conditions to modernity, become powerful, able to defend itself, no longer fearful of foreign attack, and become an admired country internationally. So I think the opening of the United States and to China had a great deal to do with catalyzing all of this. And so I am very confident that with the right policies, things can go very, very right. The problem is that at the moment, we're pretty unimaginative.
Unimaginative. Okay, that's a very interesting word to use, but I'll think about that. Before we go, maybe one last thing about, for the young people who may be watching this, how do you keep your Chinese alive without, the daily opportunity to speak it? Does it fade away, or do you have a special
Well,
way
it does to
to
some
practice?
extent. It does to some extent, but
What is
uh,
the most important tip that you have acquired that you use to learn Chinese so well?
uh, it's languages are a memory trick, as you know very well from your own studies. You have to embed words and vocabulary. You have to forget asking why people say things the way they do, and just accept that they do that. And in the case of Chinese, which is very challenging for a speaker of a Western language, because so much of Chinese lore, so many expressions are bound up in Chengyu or Xiehoyu or this kind of thing. And
How do you say
so
that? Idioms or
idiom, well, they're four character expressions, four or seven character. I guess the
gee.
sort of introduction where the last four characters are imagined somehow. So it's a very. I do have a Chinese family. I have a foster son from Beijing and a daughter-in-law, and I have two little great-granddaughters who are bilingual. And when I was learning Chinese, my then wife and I gave up English for a year and a half, and spoke only Chinese. My
Wow.
youngest child, I'll tell you this story, which may be of interest. My youngest child, little blonde, blue-eyed kid, didn't speak English. He only spoke Chinese. And when we were leaving Taiwan to come back to the United States to prepare for me to prepare for the Kissinger trip to China, we were on a boat, ship out of Yokohama, and he was very unhappy because he couldn't understand what was going on around him. He didn't like Western food. We'd only eaten Chinese food when in his infancy, and he fussed and screamed and howled. And there was a table of little old ladies next to us, and I suppose now I think they were little young ladies, but anyway, at that time they seemed quite old. And I was really upset. So as we came into Pearl Harbor, I went over to them and I said, this is breakfast. I said, I really want to apologize. My son has been misbehaving. I hope we did not ruin your Trans-Pacific travel. And they said to me, oh no, we're all deaf ladies and we're trying to read your lips and figure out what language you're speaking over there. No, I mean, I think if you're going to try to learn a language, and you have to be willing to immerse yourself. You also have to be unafraid to make a fool of yourself, because I did. And you have to be adventurous. So I remember the first phrase, full sentence I ever uttered in Thai was, I was in the garden and something wet landed on my head. And I thought to myself, how fortunate we are that pigs can't fly. The first sentence I ever issued in Arabic was, after the Koreans got to Bahrain, the dogs all disappeared. So these are absurd statements, but they were grammatically correct, which is, you have to figure that out. So that's the only tip I have. Work very hard. I remember starting to learn Chinese. A big, tall Northern Chinese guy came into the room in Washington and said in English, I'm Li Zongmi. I'm going to be in charge of your program, and I'm speaking to you in English, but you'll never hear me speak English again. He said, I just wanted to tell you one thing, and that is, somebody's probably told you Chinese is a very hard language to learn. He said, don't believe it. At that time, there were fewer Chinese. He said, there are 850 million people who speak it. Most of them are dumb as doorposts. You wouldn't be here if you weren't smart. And so if you apply yourself, if you're 很认真, 学习, you will succeed. Many foreigners have learned good Chinese.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you have to be optimistic. You have to keep trying. You have to work hard. And you have to be prepared to make a sacrifice or two.
Yeah, my 5 cent, very similar to what Mr. Lee was just saying. If a 3-year-old Chinese can learn to speak Chinese, you can too. That's how hard Chinese is.
Well, that's right. And
yeah,
but it's very interesting to interpret. It's a different skill than just speaking. It's a memory challenge.
yeah,
but there's no complete overlap between the two languages. So you have to find the best overlap in meaning that you can. And very often people get things wrong. I think I mentioned Zhang Hanshi, who I'm sorry to have learned she's not with us anymore, but she and I had a little disagreement. The American side referred to parallel policies, and she translated that, interpreted that as with a mathematical definition, 并行不悖. And I said, no, 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 that's not what it means. It means 异途同归, to reach the same result by different paths.
So how parallel the two lines are they completely are they gradually
Well,
converging
in the
somehow?
distance, if you have perspective, they
Yeah,
converge.
yeah. Well, I guess yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? But at the end of the day, every time you open up your horizon, I believe every time you learn a new language, however well you do that, I think it opens a new door, it opens a new perspective, and it's eventually extremely
Indeed,
rewarding, isn't it? I
indeed,
mean, it gives us great satisfaction and greater tools, let's say, to look at this world with, and things may get a bit clearer, may get a bit clearer. Definitely, the situation on the ground in Iran, in the world, has gotten a little bit clearer after this conversation with you, Ambassador Freeman. We appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Well, I hope I'm too pessimistic. I would like to see things move in the right direction. Maybe they will eventually.
We all do. Let's hope for the best, at least. Thank you once again.
Thank you.